drug lord was known to have hidden piles of money and drugs at his various homes around the world.
The homeowners who are renovating the property on Miami Beach, they're filming the demolition for a documentary. Local 10's Carlos Suarez live with more on what's being found.
The homeowners who are renovating the property on Miami Beach, they're filming the demolition for a documentary. Local 10's Carlos Suarez live with more on what's being found. They were never supposed to be found. Sealed beneath estates, buried under farmland, concealed behind walls thick enough to survive a military strike. Pablo Escobar's secret vaults were designed to outlast him, and for decades, most of them did. But here's what the rumors never told you. Some of those vaults have finally been opened, and what investigators found inside wasn't just money. It was a blueprint, a record of how one man built the most destructive criminal empire the modern world has ever seen, and exactly how far he was willing to go as to protect it. This is the story of Escobar's hidden empire, and it starts long before the first dollar was ever buried. An empire built from nothing. Pablo Escobar did not inherit power. He manufactured it from the streets of Medellin through a combination of raw ambition, calculated violence, and an instinct for opportunity that most people never develop and almost no one dares to act on. His earliest crimes were almost banal in their simplicity. As a teenager in the late 1960s, he stole tombstones from cemeteries around Antioquia, sandblasted the inscriptions clean, and resold them to families who had no idea where the stones had come from. It was a small operation, disrespectful, cold-blooded, and entirely without remorse. Those who knew him then later described a young man who showed no emotional connection to the harm he caused. A boy who had already separated himself from the consequences of his actions. From there, the crimes escalated with a pattern that investigators and criminologists would later study closely. Car theft followed the tombstones. Extortion followed the theft. Kidnapping followed the extortion. By 1971, Escobar's group had abducted and executed Medellin businessman Diego Echevarria, pocketing a ransom of $50,000 before disposing of the victim regardless. The killing wasn't just a crime. It was a signal, one that reached every corner of Colombia's underworld. This was a man who did not negotiate in good faith. He collected and then he eliminated. What transformed Escobar from a dangerous street criminal into something categorically different was cocaine. Not the drug itself, but the scale he recognized in it at a moment when almost no one else did. By 1976, the trade routes were still forming. Distribution networks were fragile and disorganized. The American appetite for cocaine was exploding and the infrastructure to feed it barely existed. Escobar saw all of this with startling clarity. That year, he was arrested transporting 39 kilograms hidden inside a vehicle tire near Medellin. The arrest should have ended his career. Instead, it became a lesson. He bribed his way out of detention. The officers who had arrested him were later killed. And from that moment forward, Escobar operated according to a philosophy he would articulate for the rest of his life. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. The bribe or the bullet. There was no third option. What made this creed so effective wasn't just the threat behind it. It was the consistency with which he applied it. Judges, politicians, police commanders, military officers, none were exempt. Anthropologist Mary Roldan, who has written extensively on the social history of Antioquia, later described Escobar's political corruption as systemic rather than opportunistic. He wasn't simply buying individual favors. He was purchasing institutional loyalty, converting the machinery of the Colombian state into a protection apparatus for his own operation. In April 1978, Escobar attended a meeting on a rural farm outside Medellin alongside other mid-level traffickers. That gathering is now considered by Colombian law enforcement historians to mark the formal birth of the Medellín Cartel. Within months, the combined operation was pushing approximately 19,000 kilograms of cocaine into the United States annually. Within years, that number would be almost impossible to comprehend. The weight of unlimited money. There is a figure that gets repeated whenever Escobar's wealth is discussed, and it is worth pausing on because it does not fully register the first time you hear it. At the height of his operation, the Medellín Cartel was generating an estimated $420 million per week, not per year, per week. His personal fortune, estimated by various Colombian and American law enforcement agencies, ranged between $30 and $60, equivalent to roughly $80 billion music are in today's currency. In 1987, Forbes magazine placed him on its billionaires list, estimating his fortune at $3 billion, a figure that almost certainly undercounts counted what he actually controlled. He remained on that list for 7 consecutive years. The cartel was responsible for supplying approximately 80% of the world's cocaine at its peak. More than 15 tons entered the United States daily, moving through a logistics network that used fleets of aircraft, cargo ships, and eventually purpose-built narco-submarines, vessels constructed in jungle workshops and capable of crossing the Atlantic with multi-ton shipments. The DEA's examination of Escobar's transportation infrastructure later concluded it rivaled the operational complexity of a mid-sized international freight company. He built accordingly. His estate, Hacienda Napoles, spread across 7,000 acres in Antioquia. It featured a colonial mansion at its center, surrounded by artificial lakes, a private airstrip, a bullring, and a personal zoo stocked with giraffes, elephants, and hippopotamuses imported from Africa. The hippos, famously, could not be removed after Escobar's death and established a feral population in Colombia's Magdalena River basin that still exists today, an ecological consequence that wildlife biologists are still attempting to manage. In Medellin, he constructed the 8-story Monaco building for his family, outfitting it with swimming pools, a tennis court, reinforced security systems, and a purpose-built panic room. In the Caribbean, he maintained a fortified villa on Isla Grande equipped with a helicopter pad, bullet-resistant windows, and private docking facilities. His car collection drew particular attention from investigators after his death. Among the vehicles cataloged were a Porsche 911 Carrera RSR previously campaigned by Formula One world champion Emerson Fittipaldi, a Harley-Davidson that had once belonged to Frank Sinatra, and the jet ski featured in the 1977 James Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me. Many of these were later destroyed in car bombings or seized by authorities, their burned-out shells displayed at Hacienda Napoles as grim monuments to his excess. But the most revealing detail about Escobar's wealth wasn't any single possession. It was what happened to the money he couldn't spend. His brother Roberto, who served as the cartel's chief accountant, later testified that the organization spent approximately $2,500 per month on rubber bands alone, used solely to bundle the stacks of incoming cash. He estimated that nearly 10% of all stored currency, over $2 billion annually, was lost to rats, mold, flooding, and physical decay in the warehouses and underground vaults where it was hidden. In one documented incident during a period of hiding, Escobar burned approximately $2 million in banknotes through a single night to keep his daughter warm from the cold. The detail is not exaggerated. It appears in multiple independent accounts and was confirmed by family members after his death. Money had become, in the most literal sense, disposable. The architecture of concealment. The practical problem Escobar faced was one that no financial institution could solve. The cash arriving through his operation was too voluminous to launder at the speed it was being generated. Banks couldn't absorb it, businesses couldn't process it, and keeping it in visible, accessible form made it a target from rivals, from authorities, the man, and from the network of informants that surrounded him. His solution was architectural. Across Antioquia and beyond, Escobar invested in concealment on a scale that law enforcement would spend decades attempting to map. Cartel safe houses were converted into fortified vaults, their walls hollowed out and packed floor to ceiling with currency. Farms throughout the region concealed sealed barrels buried several meters underground, many packed with wrapped bundles of US dollars that would remain untouched for years. The properties were deliberately unremarkable from the outside. Neighbors often had no idea what lay beneath their feet. The vaults themselves reflected Escobar's paranoia. Steel doors, concrete walls of exceptional thickness, chambers lined with lead sheeting to defeat early ground penetrating radar systems, access points disguised as storage rooms or utility spaces. Multiple independent construction teams were used, each working on separate sections so that no single contractor ever possessed a complete understanding of what had been built. What made the system particularly difficult to penetrate wasn't just the physical engineering. It was the human architecture surrounding it. Escobar trusted almost no one with complete information. His accountants knew financial flows, but not physical locations. His construction crews built chambers, but didn't know what would fill them. Only an inner circle of fewer than a dozen individuals, mostly family members, ever held a complete picture of where the money actually was. Roberto Escobar later described a system of coded ledgers separate from any formally documentation in which vault locations were recorded in a private notation system that only Pablo fully understood. When Escobar died in December 1993, many of those codes died with him. The rumors that surrounded his properties fed a mythology that outlasted the man himself. Underground tunnels connecting estates, torture chambers built beneath safe houses, escape passages concealed behind false walls. Some of these accounts came from law enforcement sources with documented credibility. Others emerged from the broader culture of fear that Escobar cultivated deliberately, a landscape where rumors served the same purpose as a locked door. In Miami, the pink mansion he purchased on North Bay Road in Miami Beach became one of the most scrutinized properties phase in the city's history after U.S. authorities seized it in the mid-1980s. Investigators were convinced its walls concealed hidden safes. In 2016, when new owners Christian Bertel and Jennifer Valley demolished the property, construction workers discovered exactly that: heavy concrete safes embedded in the foundation. One safe disappeared before forensic teams could examine it, prompting an investigation that was never conclusively resolved. A second was transported under armed guard to a Florida bank. A sealed metal cylinder found beneath the kitchen stove turned out to be empty, though investigators never ruled out that its contents had been removed long before the structure came down. The hunt begins. Escobar's fall did not begin with a single decisive moment. It accumulated the way pressure accumulates invisibly, then all at once. By the late 1980s, he had assassinated Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, taken down presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán at a rally in August 1989, and ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in a failed attempt to kill Galán's successor, Cesar Gaviria. The flight went down with 107 people aboard, including 2 American citizens. Their deaths crossed a threshold that brought Washington directly into the conflict. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush authorized Operation Heavy Shadow, a covert U.S. initiative to assist Colombia in dismantling the Medellín Cartel. As part of the operation, the Army deployed Centrospike, an elite signals intelligence unit specializing in intercepting communications and triangulating the positions of high-value targets. The unit had previously been used to track drug lords in Peru and Bolivia, but its deployment in Colombia marked a significant escalation of American involvement that remained classified for years. Centrospike began intercepting Escobar's calls almost immediately, building a comprehensive acoustic profile that allowed analysts to recognize his voice, his patterns of communication, and the behavioral rhythms that would eventually give away his location. By the time Escobar negotiated his controversial surrender in 1991, the Americans had already been listening to him for nearly 2 years. The surrender itself was a calculated move. Escobar negotiated a deal with the Colombian government in which he would serve a maximum of 5 years in exchange for not being extradited to the United States. Rather than enter a state-controlled facility, he was permitted to construct his own prison, La Catedral, on a mountaintop overlooking Medellin. He selected his own guards, recruited from men loyal to him personally. The compound was equipped with a football pitch, a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall, private dining facilities, and, according to accounts from both Colombian and American intelligence officials, a telescope trained on the city below. La Catedral was less a prison than a command center with theatrical fencing around it. From inside, Escobar continued to run cartel operations. In July 1992, when the Colombian government finally moved to transfer him to a legitimate facility following reports that he had ordered the torture and execution of 4 associates inside the compound, he was already gone. He had escaped through a section of wall that had been constructed by deliberate design with intentionally weakened concrete. By the time troops entered the building, Escobar had vanished into the fog of the Andes with 9 of his men. The escape humiliated the Colombian government and ended whatever patience the United States had maintained for diplomatic solutions. U.S. Ambassador Morris Busby, a former Navy officer and counterterrorism specialist, convened an emergency strategy meeting inside the embassy's steel lined vault with DEA Chief Joe Toft, CIA Station Chief Bill Wagner, and Major Steve Jacoby of Centrospike. The conclusion was unanimous. The hunt would not end in arrest. The closing trap. Colonel Hugo Martinez had been pursuing Escobar since the late 1980s. He had survived assassination attempts, discovered bombs planted beneath his family's home, and been personally offered a $6 million bribe through a mutual acquaintance, a bribe he refused without negotiation. By the time he returned from a period of temporary reassignment in Madrid in late 1992, he was rebuilt and focused. He restructured the search block into a force of 600 men, soldiers, and police trained together into a single-purpose striking unit. American support transformed Martinez's operation. Centrospike provided real-time signals intelligence that the Colombian units had never possessed before. Delta Force operators arrived in Bogotá under civilian cover in July 1992, just 2 days after Escobar's escape from La Catedral. Their operational role was carefully constructed to avoid violating Colombian law prohibiting foreign combat troops on national soil, technically serving as advisors and trainers while providing intelligence that directly drove raid operations. The pursuit fractured Escobar's support network systematically. Los Peeps, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged as an extrajudicial force composed of former allies turned enemies. Their membership included the widows of Fernando Galeano and William Moncada, 2 cartel partners Escobar had executed in 1992 after a dispute over money. Alongside them was Diego Murillo, known as Don Berna, a former Escobar lieutenant who had watched the man devour his own network and chosen survival over loyalty. Los Peeps bombed Escobar's properties, killed his associates, and and sent unmistakable messages by leaving bodies in public spaces. While U.S. officials publicly condemned their methods, DA agent Javier Pena later acknowledged in interviews that the group's campaign was arguably the single most effective pressure applied against Escobar during the entire hunt. They destroyed his infrastructure faster than it could be rebuilt and eliminated the sense of invulnerability that had always been central to his psychological control. Dolores Ahumada Moncada, wife of the man Escobar had killed, was brought to Washington under DEA protection and registered as informant AE92053. Her intelligence on Escobar's finances, properties, and inner circle was, according to DEA analysts, among the most operationally valuable human intelligence the agency received during the entire operation. Her younger brother, a student at MIT with no connection to the cartel, had been kidnapped and killed in retaliation for her cooperation. After that, her determination to see Escobar destroyed was, in the words of one official who worked with her, total and absolute. From a U.S. federal prison, Carlos Letter, once Escobar's glamorous partner in the Bahamas operation, wrote a detailed letter to the DEA describing Escobar's current movements, his reliance on rotating safe houses, his habit of communicating through cell phone networks in brief, irregular bursts, and a physical reality that intelligence operatives found useful. Escobar was significantly overweight, unfit, and incapable of moving quickly over any distance. The walls were closing. The final hours. By December 1993, Escobar had been a fugitive for more than 16 months. He was moving between rented houses in Medellin's residential neighborhoods, relying on a shrinking circle of trusted contacts, aware that the intelligence closing around him was unlike anything he had faced before. On December 2nd, one day after his 44th birthday, he made the call that ended everything. He phoned his son Juan Pablo for an extended conversation, staying on the line far longer than operational security should have permitted. The call was intercepted by centrist Spike. Within hours, triangulation had narrowed his location to a residential street in the Los Olivos neighborhood, a middle-class district so ordinary, so close to the heart of the city he had once controlled, that the simplicity of his hiding place almost defied belief. Martinez's men moved on the address before dawn. Inside a modest two-story row house, Escobar and his driver, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as El Limón, were waiting. A police officer spotted a long-haired, bearded man at an upstairs window. The figure was heavier than any recent photograph suggested, but the hunters had been listening to his voice for years. They knew the assault lasted less than 3 minutes. El Limón broke for a window, fell onto a lower roof, and was shot while attempting to flee. Escobar followed seconds later, armed with 2 pistols, one of them the SIG Sauer he had ceremonially surrendered at La Cathedral 2 years earlier. He crossed the rooftops, returning fire until 3 rounds struck him. One in the leg, one in the back, one through the right ear. He was found minutes later, motionless on the tile. The question of who fired the fatal shot was never conclusively answered. Search block officer Hugo Aguilar claimed responsibility. Don Berna insisted it was his brother. American conspiracy theorists argued that a U.S. operator had pulled the trigger, a claim that centrist Spike veterans have consistently denied, though they acknowledge they cannot account for every individual in the vicinity during the final minutes of the assault. DA agent Steve Murphy, who arrived and took the first formal photographs, recorded a scene already contaminated by the crowd of officers, journalists, and onlookers who had flooded the property before any forensic protocol could be established. A forensic re-examination in 2020, using ballistic gel reconstructions and updated wound analysis, supported a theory originally advanced by journalist Mark Bowden, author of Killing Pablo, the definitive account of the manhunt. The fatal headshot, delivered by a 9mm handgun at close range, showed wound characteristics inconsistent with a shot fired from distance. The barrel may have been pressed directly to his skull. Whether that barrel was held by a Colombian officer, a Los Peeps operative, or Escobar himself has never been formally determined. The official coroner's report denied suicide. Its unusual decision to issue that denial in the form of a press release unprompted before the question had been publicly raised struck several forensic pathologists at the time as precisely the kind of clarification that produces more doubt than it resolves. What remains beneath the ground? After Escobar's death, Colombia attempted to account for the billions that had moved through the cartel during its peak years. The results were humbling. Colombian authorities have officially recovered approximately $75 million in Escobar-connected assets, a figure that investigators widely believe represents less than 10% of what was actually hidden. In 1989, photographs published by Colombian newspapers documented $4 million discovered in buried barrels in Antioquia. In 1990, $25 million was recovered alongside gold bars from a cartel warehouse. In 2009, $10 million was found during renovation work at Hacienda Napoles, where workers broke through a concrete floor and discovered a sealed chamber that had been undisturbed for nearly 2 decades. In 2020, Escobar's nephew Nicolas Escobar now claimed to have recovered $18 million from a house in Medellin. Guided, he said, by by a vision. He described bundles of cash wrapped in plastic alongside a gold pen, a manual typewriter, and a satellite phone. Most of the currency had been destroyed by moisture and fungal growth. He acknowledged the find was not the first he had made and declined to say where any of the others had been. In 2017, the Discovery Channel's documentary series Finding Escobar's Millions brought former CIA operatives Doug Lowe and Ben Smith to Colombia with ground-penetrating radar, drones, and metal detection equipment. Their investigation documented the sophistication of Escobar's concealment methodology in detail. Lead-line safes, false floors, vaulted chambers designed to be invisible to standard scanning technology of the era. They uncovered one safe that turned out to be empty. They never found the billions. In Antioquia, a farmer uncovered sealed drums of U.S. currency, so well preserved that investigators described the bills as appearing freshly printed. The legal question of who owned the find, the farmer, the Colombian state, or the victims of cartel violence, was never fully resolved and ignited a debate about recovery policy that continues in modified form today. The most unsettling conclusion drawn by the researchers, investigators, and forensic accountants who have spent decades attempting to trace Escobar's hidden fortune is a simple one. Most of it is probably still out there, buried in fields, sealed behind concrete in properties that have changed hands multiple times, sitting in vaults beneath land no one has yet thought to examine. The rats and the mold are still working. In some cases, is the money what the vaults really contain? When Colombian authorities raided Hacienda Napoles and the network of safe houses connected to it in the early 1990s, they found what everyone expected: stacks of currency, sealed containers, the physical evidence of a cash-based empire running at industrial scale. What they didn't expect, or perhaps what they hadn't fully prepared themselves to confront, was the documentation. Hidden in waterproof containers throughout the vaults were ledgers, meticulous, handwritten records of shipment schedules, payment rosters, and financial transactions stretching from Colombia to Miami to Madrid. Lists of bribes organized by recipient, amount, and date. The names of politicians, judges, police commanders, and military officers who had been on the cartel's payroll. Organized not by moral category, but by operational usefulness, the way a business would organize its vendors. For prosecutors in both Colombia and the United States, these records were extraordinary. They confirmed, in Escobar's own documentation, what investigators had suspected but struggled to legally establish: that the corruption enabling the cartel's operation was not peripheral to its structure. It was the structure. Former associates and residents of properties connected to Escobar also described rooms that never appeared in official documentation. Soundproof spaces fitted with drainage systems and metal hooks that served no architectural purpose a legitimate structure would require. Investigators never formally confirmed the existence of interrogation chambers or torture rooms within the vault networks, but the physical descriptions collected from multiple independent sources over many years were consistent enough that Colombian law enforcement historians have treated them as credible. Escobar built his vaults to protect his wealth. What they actually preserved was evidence of what that wealth had cost. Pablo Escobar was shot dead on a Medellin rooftop on December 2nd, 1993. Colombia celebrated in the streets. The United States congratulated itself on the effectiveness of its covert operation. And for one moment, the weight of terror that had pressed down on an entire country for nearly 2 decades seemed to lift. It didn't disappear. The Medellin Cartel's collapse created space that was filled almost immediately by the Cali Cartel, already organized, already operational, and waiting. Colombia's cocaine export capacity barely faltered. The violence that had been Escobar's instrument became the instrument of whoever came next. What ended on that rooftop was not the drug war. What ended was one man's extraordinary grip on it. A man who had started with stolen tombstones and built over less than 20 years an empire so vast that a significant portion of its wealth has never been found. Some of those vaults have been opened. Most of them haven't. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this, properly researched, properly told, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.